Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction, Susan. We're so glad you're able to be here with us today for the webinar on leading with humility, global perspectives, and personality insights. So in terms of how we're going to spend our time together today, we're going to begin by defining humble leadership, drawing on a variety of different perspectives. We'll then debunk some myths about humble leadership, clearing up some common misconceptions about humility and leadership. Next, we will leverage insights from our global leadership effectiveness study to examine global perspectives on leading with humility. And lastly, we will leverage Hogan personality insights to link scales to humble leadership and note some behavioral recommendations for developing humility in leaders. And we will also be sure to leave ample time at the end for some Q&A. So let's get started by looking at how different sources define humble leadership. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, humility is defined as the quality of being humble or having a lowly opinion of oneself. Meekness, lowliness, humbleness, the opposite of pride or haughtiness. Similarly, Merriam-Webster defines it as freedom from pride or arrogance, the quality or state of being humble. And dictionary.com defines it as the quality or condition of being humble, modest opinion or estimate of one's own importance. So when we look at how humility is defined in everyday language and in dictionaries like these, it often sounds non-leader-like, even self-deprecating. Words like lowly, meekness, and a low estimation of one's own importance seem to suggest humility is about shrinking oneself. If we just stop here, humility can seem incompatible with leadership. But this view is largely outdated. Modern leadership research has begun to redefine humility as a strength. Specifically, humble leadership researchers have consistently identified 3 consistent observable behaviors that define humble leadership. These involve a willingness to have an accurate view of oneself, acknowledging both strengths and limitations, an appreciation of other strengths and contributions, and an openness to feedback, new ideas, and a willingness to learn. Similarly, the Hogan competency model also defines humility by 3 key behaviors. These include displaying modesty, acknowledging limitations, and seeking feedback. And this Hogan competency of humility was identified as part of a comprehensive development process aimed at understanding how personality relates to commonly used workplace competencies. And it represents how humility is defined across a variety of academic, commercial, and government competency models. So now we've moved from seeing humility as a weakness to understanding it as a strength, and now, from Hogan's perspective, as something that's measurable and actionable.
Now that we know how humility is defined, let's go over the ins and outs of humble leadership. To do this, we'll go through 5 myths, debunking each myth along the way. Now, as you may already know, Dr. Hogan talks often about the difference between emerging as a leader and being effective as a leader. So our first myth taps into humility and leadership emergence. Specifically, our first myth is humility hurts being perceived as a leader. As Zaina highlighted, the general public tends to describe humility in a way that seems counter to the way we describe leaders. To illustrate, when we describe humility, we tend to consider aspects like having a lowly opinion of oneself, being meek, and having a low estimation of one's importance or rank. When we describe leaders, we tend to consider aspects that almost seem like opposites. For example, we may attribute being confident, assertive, maybe even strong-willed, or having a commanding presence to leaders. But over the last 20 years, we've better understood that humility encompasses aspects like being better aware of what you know and what you don't know. It's realizing you don't always have to have the answers. There can be power in leaning on others to be effective in your leadership role. This idea of humility being more of a strength rather than a weakness in leaders really came to light in the early 2000s with books like Good to Great by Jim Collins entering the mainstream. And since then, organizational researchers have increasingly attended to the power of humility in leadership. But we'd like to acknowledge that humility may not be easily detected in individuals. It can be subtle and it can take time to notice in others. Arguably, we observe aspects that counter perceptions of humility more quickly than we do humility itself. For example, you may have noticed aspects like arrogance or self deprecation more quickly in others than you have humility. But over time and through assessments, you can identify those who are likely to demonstrate humility in their leadership role. Now, that was our first myth. And similar to our first myth, our second myth also regards leadership emergence. So, myth number 2 is humble leaders are not confident. As we've discussed, it seems like having humility means lacking confidence. I'd imagine it's easy for someone to draw this conclusion quickly if they heard their leader say, I'm not sure, or I don't know. But just because we may make this association does not mean it's always right. We have to remember that our understanding of what humility is has evolved over the last 2 decades. Humility does not mean having a lowly view of oneself. It means having an accurate view of oneself, one's strengths, and one's limitations. Additionally, our research at Hogan shows that humility and displaying confidence can be positively associated. And this makes sense when we know a person can be confident while saying they don't know something. We argue it's what a leader does with that awareness of their limitation that is key. So, for example, a leader could evade the situation. They could dismiss others to make themselves seem important or superior, or they could distract others from their lack of knowledge or misunderstanding. Or a leader could take the road that would demonstrate humility. They could seek others' feedback, or they could lean on others to help fill that knowledge gap that's present or correct that misunderstanding that's been had. By acknowledging, appreciating, and being open to the contributions and strengths of others, a leader can be better, someone that people want to follow. And so ultimately, we recognize that a leader can and should be both humble and confident. At this point, we've covered myths pertaining to humility and leadership emergence. So now let's debunk myths that regard humility and leadership effectiveness. Our third myth is humble leaders are not effective. As we've stated, humility can be a strength in leaders. And this isn't just something we're saying, it's something organizational researchers continue to find in their research studies. Research shows that humility not only predicts effective leadership, but has also been linked to several positive outcomes for employees. For example, it's been linked to higher job satisfaction, as well as higher affective commitment or one's emotional connection to their organization. It's also been linked to greater levels of creativity and voice, or one's willingness to share their thoughts and ideas. It's been linked to greater organizational citizenship behaviors. These are voluntary behaviors that help the organization and go beyond one's job's requirement. Lastly, leader humility has been linked to employee performance. But as Dr. Hogan has pointed out before, highly effective leaders, they're not just humble, they're fiercely competitive too. And so it's important that we remember that humility is just one component of effective leadership. In addition to humility, aspects like displaying confidence, being competitive, And possessing attributes that allow a leader to meet their goals and drive business forward may be incredibly important for being effective too.
And this leads us to our fourth myth of humble leaders hurt the recognition of teams. If people who are high on humility are less likely to focus on themselves, then there might be this reasoning that they might neglect to find ways to get the team recognized by the organization. And the reasoning is that because humble leaders may not seek out that spotlight, there's this concern that leaders may not get the organization to recognize their team as the organization should. But while humble leaders are free of pride, this does not mean that they will not make the efforts to ensure others shine. And so, if we were to examine a leader with absolutely no humility, this leader may trend in taking credit for their team's achievements, be closed minded towards others' opinions, and lack accountability for their own behavior. Well, this hurts the team. It decreases trust in the leader and it lowers team psychological safety. So people feel their ideas may not be valued, and their leader might even shame them for their own ideas. And so there's little trust in the leader. And so this team may likely experience weakened team cohesion as well as collaboration. An arrogant leader who loves their own ideas and wants to be the center of the attention does not create a high performing team. And negative relationships with one's manager plays a critical role in why they quit or why they leave a team. And so the team may experience more turnover and lower satisfaction and team morale. But on the other hand, if we were to look at a leader with humility, we're going to see a completely different story. So humility has been found to be successful in teams. Humble leadership fosters shared credit. When the team leader receives credit, the leader is more likely to recognize their team as well for the team's successes. And also, team members feel their voices and opinions are heard, valued, and considered. So team trust is enhanced as people learn to trust the team leader and they feel that they can safely express their thoughts. So a humble leader is more likely to create a psychologically safe and inclusive climate. This also enhances team collaboration and morale. So humble leaders create stability and they create engagements within their teams. So as humble leaders empower and support their teams are able to deliver on results. And this shows that they are high performers and it gains them a positive reputation and can even increase their visibility within the organization. So overall, humble leaders can empower as well as support their teams. And then the final myth that we want to address is that we have been highlighting the positive attributes of a humble leader, and it seems as though this leadership style will fix all teams and is effective across all contexts. And while there are a plethora of positive qualities to a humble leader, there could be some situations in which a leader may want to demonstrate more or less humility. And so research has shown that humility is really great for leaders who need to have their team members be creative, brainstorm new ideas, as well as create innovative solutions. And so when teams need to be able to openly generate and share ideas, they need to feel safe to voice their opinions. Humble leaders can create really great environments for these teams. And then also for teams who need to be flexible and adjust frequency and swiftly, this could all be due to constantly changing markets or taking new risks. So, teams with humble leaders who are willing to accept feedback and act on that feedback, these are really great leaders who show humble leadership. This is really great environments for them. And then, thirdly, humble leaders are really great for teams and organizations where there is a low power distance structure. So when organizations have a flat hierarchy, humble leadership excels in its natural element. And so when the organization has more of a flat hierarchy and people are anticipating greater egalitarianism, these leaders will demonstrate humility. And when they demonstrate humility, this fosters greater knowledge and information sharing within the team. And it's been shown that teams were more creative. but a leader may choose to lean less into humility in other situations. And so it's been shown that there are times when leader humility is not the best for teams. So, for example, when there is a crisis that has to be immediately addressed, a leader may lean less into humility because decisions need to be made swiftly. There's less collaboration in those decisions. Additionally, so when a team is in an uncertain environment or time, such as the future of the team is ambiguous, a leader may lean less into humility because it might be more beneficial for that time. And then when there is a high power distance in an organization and team members anticipate a hierarchy and a leader who demonstrates dominance and power, a leader may want to exhibit less humility so as not to appear indecisive and create doubt among their followers. So, there are times and places when demonstrating humility will be beneficial or can be detrimental to the team. So a leader needs to know when to flex one's humility and when not to, because there may be times when they need to show less humility and other times when they should show more humility.
Okay. Now that we have a stronger understanding of the ins and outs of humble leadership, we want to present research that sheds light on perceptions of leading with humility from working adults around the world. Specifically, given the wealth of research demonstrating the power of humility for leadership, we wanted to know when people think of the ideal leader, is humility a key aspect of that perception? To address this question, we asked employees from companies around the world to complete a 15-minute survey. This work was a part of Hogan's data collection effort known as the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study, or GLES, sometimes also called the GLES survey. The study involved asking employees around the world to indicate the extent to which each of Hogan's 62 competencies from Hogan's competency model was important for being an ideal leader. Employees rated these 62 competencies on a scale from 0, not important for being an ideal leader, to 4, extremely important for being an ideal leader. And so the research we present today could not have happened without the hard work of Hogan's GLES study team and the recruitment efforts of companies and distributors that we work with around the globe. Our sample consisted of 6,332 working adults. From the sample, 56% were women. The age range was 18 to 84, and 64% of our sample were leaders and 36% were individual contributors. Working adults covered over 90 countries. And for context, the top 3 countries in our sample were the US, mainland China, and Taiwan, Greater China, each making up over 5% of our sample. And lastly, working adults covered over 22 industries. Again, for context, the top 3 industries in our sample were business support services, banking and financial services, and information technology, each making up over 5% of our sample. So when we asked working adults to what extent humility, according to Hogan's perspective, is necessary for being an ideal leader, we learned that humility ranked 48th out of the 62 competencies evaluated. Now, that seems like humility ranked relatively low, but it's worth noting that working adults rated humility on a scale from 0, not important for being an ideal leader, to 4, extremely important for being an ideal leader. And the average rating for humility across working adults from these 90 plus countries that we examined was 3. Given our rating scale, a 3 suggests that humility was still considered very important for being an ideal leader. Humility just wasn't as important as other competencies evaluated, like decision-making, accountability, or communication, for example. Now, when we isolated analyses to working adults from Taiwan only, we found humility ranked 58th out of the 62 competencies evaluated. The average rating for working adults from Taiwan was very close to the global average at 2.99. And so, since working adults rated humility on that scale from 0 to 4, a 2.99 suggests that humility was seen as quite important for being an ideal leader. Again, it just wasn't as important as other competencies evaluated. Now, we did not just want to leave our results at that. We wanted to also examine context. As Jessica mentioned, it's important to keep in mind. So we set out to address the question, do perceptions of humility differ based on the perceiver's gender? When we examined working adults from all 90 plus countries in our data set, we found that women perceived humility as more important for the ideal leader compared to men. But it's worth noting that the strength of this difference, or the effect size, was negligible. For my statistics friends, Cohen's D was around 0.07. Ultimately, this 0.07 value tells us that the significant difference we found is not meaningful in practical terms. In other words, we may not even notice the statistical difference in practice. Now, when we isolated analyses to examine working adults from Taiwan only, we found that perceptions of humility for the ideal leader did not differ depending on the perceiver's gender. Said differently, humility was considered important to a similar extent by both men and women. We also set out to address the question, do perceptions of humility differ based on the perceiver's job level? So we examined 4 job levels: the individual contributor, frontline supervisor, middle manager, and executive levels. When we examined all working adults from all 90 plus countries, we found that the answer was yes. Perceptions of humility did differ depending on the perceiver's job level. That is, we found that executives viewed humility as significantly more important for the ideal leader compared to individual contributors, compared to frontline supervisors, and compared to middle managers. Interestingly, when we isolated analyses to examine working adults from Taiwan only, we found that perceptions of humility for the ideal leader did not differ depending on the perceiver's job level. Humility was considered important to a similar extent by individual contributors, frontline leaders, middle-level managers, and executive leaders. But I should note that we did not have a relatively large sample of executives from Taiwan completing our survey, but they did consider humility as relatively more important than the other 3 job level groups we examined. And so we think that if there was a larger executives group, that we may see results be more consistent with our global results. Lastly, we set out to address the question, do perceptions of humility differ based on the perceiver's country they reside in? We found that the answer was yes. Humility seemed to be relatively more important in countries like France, Mexico, Canada, and Spain. On this next slide, as you can see, countries like India, Czech Republic, and South Africa saw humility as relatively important, just not as important as other competencies evaluated. Still, these countries had humility ranked at a higher spot than the average global ranking of 48th. Lastly, we found humility seemed to be relatively less important for the ideal leader compared to other competencies evaluated in countries like Vietnam, Lebanon, Egypt, Taiwan, Greater China, and mainland China. Mainland China, as you can see, ranked humility 62nd out of 62 competencies. Their average rating for humility was around 2.55 on that scale from 0, not important for being an ideal leader, to 4, extremely important for being an ideal leader. So about a 0.44 difference from the average rating for humility for Taiwan, which, as I mentioned before, was at a 2.99. So what does this all mean? Our hope was to provide a more global perspective of where humility perceptions stand for the ideal leader. When examining working adults from around the world, we find that humility ranks relatively lower compared to other competencies. However, we also found that the level of importance can differ depending on the context. That is, we found that executive leaders perceived humility as more important compared to other job levels. We also found that certain countries see humility as important overall, just not as important as other competencies evaluated, like decision making, accountability, or communication, for example. We'd also like to point out that there seems to be a trend in terms of which countries prize humility for the ideal leader. So countries in North America like Mexico, Canada, and the US, as well as countries where English is the primary native language, so the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, all seem to perceive humility as a key aspect of the ideal leader. We also aim to provide a more Taiwan-specific perspective of where perceptions of humility stand for the ideal leader. When we isolated analyses to examine working adults from Taiwan only, we found that the importance of humility did not differ much depending on the context we examined. Men and women seemed to view the importance of humility to a similar extent, and working adults, regardless of job level, also seem to view the importance of humility to a similar extent. So why does this matter? Although we don't necessarily have the sample sizes that represent every working adult in every country, our results point to the importance of context when it comes to perceptions of humility for the ideal leader. Because we don't want to overgeneralize our findings, we encourage organizations to assess whether leading with humility is important for leaders' performance, as well as whether leader humility is valued at their particular organization. This information may dictate how we approach developing humility in leaders. Lastly, we'd encourage those working across countries to be mindful of potential cross-cultural differences in perceptions around leading with humility. Leaders should keep in mind that humility isn't considered important for the ideal leader to the same extent universally. Perceptions may vary country to country.
So now we know humility isn't one size fits all. It's largely dependent on the context. But while context matters, so do the people themselves. Individual personality characteristics also play a key role in how humility shows up day to day. By leveraging Hogan personality insights, we can start to better understand humility and how to develop it more intentionally in leaders. Our 3 rigorously validated assessments at Hogan, the Hogan Personality Inventory, the Hogan Development Survey, and the motives, values, preferences inventory are systematic measures of the bright side, dark side, and inside of personality. More specifically, the HPI describes everyday strengths and weaknesses that provide insight into how people will work, lead, and achieve success in their careers. It assesses how someone will be seen by others on a day-to-day basis. The HTS identifies overused strengths. So unmanaged, these behaviors can degrade leadership effectiveness, erode the quality of business and personal relationships, and derail careers. The MBPI concerns personal goals, interests, and drivers. So these values and motives will energize someone to the extent that they will enjoy a job, career, and organization when they are satisfied, or they will potentially cause someone to leave a job, career, or organization when they are not satisfied. In other words, the MBPI provides a measure of fit. So in sum, these three assessments can help us understand if someone can do a job, what might get in their way when doing that job, and whether they will like the job. So to explore how these three assessments align with humble leadership, we applied a 5-stage approach. To start, 3 Hogan researchers dove into the academic literature on humble leadership, focusing specifically on articles that explored how personality and specific competencies contribute to humility in leaders. From there, we turned to Hogan's own data, beginning first with data collected via our custom client research. Specifically, we reviewed criterion-related validation studies, examining how personality predicts humility. We analyzed data from over 2,000 job incumbents at this step. We also analyzed the relationship between Hogan's personality scales and humble leadership, utilizing data from 294 participants that was collected by our data science team through an online research platform as part of a broader study. Next, we tapped into Hogan's reputation research. So here we analyzed data from over 1,000 participants to better understand the personality characteristics of individuals who tend to be perceived as humble by others. And finally, by integrating insights from the academic literature with the findings from each of these data sources, we identified 9 Hogan personality scales that best capture what humble leadership looks like, both in theory and in practice. So, starting with the HPI, we identified higher interpersonal sensitivity, higher prudence, and moderate learning approach as important scales for humble leaders. Leaders who score higher on interpersonal sensitivity tend to be cooperative, diplomatic, and communicate with warmth. That aligns closely with humility because humble leaders are approachable, team-oriented, and foster psychological safety. So people feel heard and respected when they are around them. Leaders who score higher on prudence tend to be honest, dependable, and hold themselves accountable for mistakes. As you might recall, humble leaders aren't impulsive or self-serving. They take accountability for their mistakes, and they're honest to others about their limitations. And leaders who score more in that middle range, or what we call moderate on learning approach, tend to seek self-development opportunities and are interested in applying new knowledge on the job. So this aligns with humble leadership because humble leaders remain open to learning and growth so that they're better able to support their team. Turning now to the HDS, we identified lower skeptical and leisurely, and moderate bold as important scales for humble leaders. Leaders who score lower on skeptical and leisurely tend to build trusting relationships, listen to others' ideas, be open to multiple perspectives, and be genuine, direct, and open to feedback. As you might recall from some of the definitions and behavioral indicators we discussed about humility, humble leaders are open to other ideas, perspectives, and feedback, aligning very closely with the lower ends of these 2 scales. And then moderate bold is associated with being confident and assertive, while also balancing a realistic view of oneself. As Nadine noted earlier, humble does not mean not confident. The key is having that accurate self-view. So humble leaders will project self-assurance without arrogance. And lastly, for the MBPI, we identified moderate recognition and power and higher altruistic as important scales for humble leaders. So leaders who score in the moderate ranges of recognition and power will value opportunities to be noticed, but also recognize the achievements of others, just like they will value working together and lead with an emphasis on achieving shared goals. What we see in humble leaders is really a balance across these values. They're not chasing the spotlight for themselves, but they're comfortable to step into it when it helps the team. And they're driven to make an impact, but it's more about we, not me. And finally, leaders who score higher on that altruistic value support others' development and success. This genuine motivation to serve others and contribute to something larger than themselves is a hallmark of humility in leaders.
With a better understanding of how personality relates to humble leadership, the question then becomes, what are some things leaders can do to develop themselves as a humble leader? And humble leadership is about behavioral habits. So thinking feedback seeking, credit sharing, things that can be cultivated with intention, reflection, and personality insight. And so there are three overarching areas that we want to consider. The first is that leaders should work on evolving their self awareness. Leaders should be aware of their strengths and their limitations. The HPI, HTS, and MVPI scales that Zaina presented can be used to facilitate an evolved self awareness. And individuals need to take ownership of their mistakes, their failures, and shortcomings. Sharing one's mistakes can be regarded as a unique strength. And leaders who share that they do not know everything and acknowledge their knowledge gaps, this shows them to being human. And this can create better interactions and relationships with their followers and their team members. But leaders also need to recognize the appropriate times to be vulnerable with others. Research has shown that when it is important to demonstrate your competence, or when signs of one's leader authority are more ambiguous or uncertain, showing humility may cause followers to question the leader's ability to perform in that role. But when we look at highly visible leader roles, such as an executive, in which people can see clear external signs of authority, sharing one's mistakes and knowledge gaps can have a positive impact on the organization or the team, and it can lead the followers to being more engaged. A second area in developing humble leaders is through modeling teachability. So when leaders open up about knowledge gaps or mistakes, they need to make sure they are also open to learning from situations and from others. Ask others for feedback and advice, but not just ask, apply it. Demonstrate continual learning through taking action on the feedback, criticism, and advice that one receives. Also, humble leaders encourage people to present new ideas and alternative perspectives. Leaders should be open minded to other suggestions and seriously consider the ideas and perspectives rather than possibly disregarding what they say. And then finally, leaders can demonstrate their humility and model teachability by engaging in follower tasks, no matter how possibly menial that task is, such as walking the sales floor with their followers, taking sales calls. And so it's doing these menial tasks and then accepting feedback from their followers and listening to them as well. So, by modeling teachability, leaders can create this culture of development. And this culture of development and modeling teachability is really enhanced when the organization from the top also supports this. And then finally, a third area in which people should consider as they develop into humble leaders is empowering recognition and development. So, in order to do this, leaders should recognize and appreciate other people's strengths and contributions. So, being aware of self promoting actions, and if you're taking credits for other people's or for followers' accomplishments. So, leaders should highlight work and successes as a team rather than as an individual and spotlight others' achievements, and then mentor and coach others to facilitate their growth. So rather than focusing solely on one's self career trajectory, humble leaders also help other individuals with their career trajectories and performance improvements. As a leader recognizes others and spotlights their strengths, they also need to make sure that they are sincere. So it has been shown that if leaders are not perceived by others as being sincere, honest, and genuine, followers are more likely to have a negative reaction. So there's that additional component that leaders need to consider. And so by having this authentic, other focus rather than this self-focus, individuals can find themselves developing into more humble leaders. And then we've mentioned before that there are times or contexts in which humble leaders excel and other times and contexts when they may struggle. So understanding the context will help a leader identify when to demonstrate more or less humility. And we've mentioned a few of these earlier, such as during times of crises or ambiguous times, or when there's a team of high powered distances, and even in certain countries that perceive humility as being less critical for the ideal leader. So, if a leader finds themselves displaying more humility than they should, then they may struggle making decisions quickly because they're gathering other people's opinions, and this may make them perceived as indecisive rather than as a collaborator. They may also be viewed as others by being overly dependent. So, leaders who desire to show humility really need to consider how much humility to portray and also consider when they have received sufficient opinions from others. A leader does not need to consider how leaning into humble leadership could impact their reputation in certain contexts. And while we've mentioned a few ways in which leaning into humble leadership can negatively impact someone's reputation, we do want to be mindful that this can also go the other way. So when a leader leans into humble leadership at just the right times, they can see a positive impact on their reputation as they're seen as someone who cares about others' opinions, and they're flexible, and they're open to others' ideas and solutions. And so it has been found that humble leadership has had a strong impact when leaders had even more empower. So as someone is promoted up through an organization, increasing their power, increasing those signs of power visibility, that individual should consider leaning more and more into humble leadership. So overall, it's critical for leaders to not only know how to develop themselves as humble leaders, but also when to lean into humble leadership. And so this brings us up to our key takeaways that we really want to emphasize. If you were to remember just a few things from our webinar, we want you to remember that confidence and humility are not on the same spectrum. They are distinct constructs. So leaders can show humility and be confident. As someone becomes more self aware, they know their weaknesses, but then they can be confident in their strengths. And then a majority of leaders fail because being a leader is hard, but humility is a critical component to being an effective leader. And research has shown there's an abundance of positive outcomes with humble leaders. Humble leadership is a lot more about getting along rather than this focus on getting ahead of others. And then thirdly, the context matters. As you lead your team, understand your team members, understand who you are leading and what kind of leader they need and value. So by understanding your context, you'll be able to flex the right amount of humility at the right times. And then finally, a personality insights can help develop an individual into a humble leader. With Hogan's unique perspective on personality, an individual can not only gain a better idea of their strengths and limitations, but also understand their reputation as a leader and how they better engage in humble behaviors as a leader. So with that, I think we will pass it back over to Susan.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. And if anyone has any questions, you can tag into the Q&A box at the bottom of the page. 请大家如果有问题的时候放在最下面这边。刚不好意思说英文。那okay. I have a question. If you have a very narcissistic or self-centered leader or colleague, how will you help them develop their humility? 如果你的同事或者是领导者比较自恋，你觉得要如何去发展他的谦虚的特质？ Yes, please. So how will you do that?
Yeah, I can start on this one, and Jessica, Nadine, feel free to add anything I miss. But we showed that personality can be leveraged. So looking at their personality profile and seeing what scales they might be able to help leverage in like exuding those humble leadership behaviors that might come a little more naturally, and then working to develop on the ones that might not. So again, this is a very behavioral competency. So even if someone it doesn't come very naturally to them by their personality, there's things that you can do like asking for feedback that is a behavior, and also recognizing your team, as was mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, is just a behavior that anyone can enact and work on improving. Nadine, Jessica,
Okay.
anything to add?
Oh, can you
Um,
pause for me to translate this first before I
Yeah,
forget?
sorry,
yes.
go ahead,
Sorry.
Susan.
好，刚刚 Zena 她分享的是说，其实我们可以从她的性格的轮廓来看一下，有哪一些在行为上面可以做一些调整。例如说，你可以提醒她多做一些，寻求一些回馈，或者是要提醒她要去肯定她的同事跟团队，这都是从一些行为上面来做一些调整。好，anything else? I'm sorry, Nadine.
I think what Zaina said is great. And I think another key thing to make sure is that leader genuinely wants to improve that humility too. So in addition to knowing where they're at and the certain behaviors they can engage in, I think it can go a long way that development or effort is genuine.
一定提醒的是说，有一个重点就是这个领导者必须自己有觉察到他需要调整，而且他想要调整。所以呢，他第一件事情就是需要知道自己现在的状况，然后呢，才知道说要从这边开始去做一些调整。I see. Let me see. I think there are questions in the Q&A session. Okay. All right. One of the question is, I noticed that a lot of false humility in high-power distance culture. How can we help leaders be aware? 好，这个问题是说，在那种权力有一些距离的文化里面呢，会注意这位提问者，他会注意到一些虚假的谦虚。那我们要怎么样帮助他们更觉察？ Yes. How can they be more aware?
I think that one is looking at their personality and identifying the different where they are lacking. So the scales that Zaina presented on, we can really pinpoint of this is why one area why they might be having this false humility, because they're not demonstrating a lower leisurely. I think that could be one area where they can be called out. I'm assuming that's what they want for awareness is how do we call leaders out for having false humility?
You mean low leisurely? Low leisurely?
Oh, I'm sorry. Any of the scales that Zaina presented on. So if a leader is opposite of any of the scales that we presented in the webinar, I think that's an area where you can call them out and say, hey, we really need to develop here because your humility, you might say that you have humility, but according to your personality report, that's not necessarily true.
OK，刚刚那个他是说，我们从刚刚的分享里面有一些主维度呢是会影响这个谦虚的。如果你看到这个里面的维度的分数跟其实他们所说的，他们号称他很谦虚，可是这个维度看起来是比较低的。你可以从这些来找出其中一些是不是虚假的谦虚的信号，那从中间来觉察。我们可以从这个性格的测评的那些分数来看。OK， Okay, another question is, how do we encourage senior leaders to take ownership of mistakes and failures? Let me translate in Chinese first. 我们怎么样要鼓励资深的领导者呢，去为他们自己或者自己的错误或失败来负起责任？Yes, please. Okay. How do we encourage senior leaders to take ownership of mistakes and failures?
I think what would be really helpful is if leaders see that there is strength in leaning on their team or leaning on others to keep the work moving forward. I think it's really important that leaders understand that they are a big part of driving performance and results in an organization, but they also need to rely on their team to be able to do that. And so having that understanding that you are you're greater when you have the sum of your group at play is really critical. And so showing them that their strength in numbers is going to be really big, and being able to lean on others so that they can be developed and they can, be able to tackle a problem, to grow and develop in their role. There's probably some like reframing there too for that senior leader to be an example for others, to be able to fill in that knowledge gap, to be able to correct the mistake, to be able to step up. And in that way, there's a greater emphasis of, I would say a sort of idea of being not bigger than the other people in the room. It's about leveling yourself out for the greater good of whatever the goal is. So all that to say is, I think it's a matter of showing them that there is strength in admitting mistakes and owning failures, that to be that role model for others so that they can also grow and develop themselves.
Okay. 美定是说，他呢是觉得是，如果能够让这些资深的领导者看得到，是说他们的确是对这个组织很重要，但同时呢，整个团队也是很重要的。那在这个时候呢，如果能够把自己缩小一点点，然后呢，让他们看见说，他们如果可以，用承认错误或承认失败这个把它变成一个优点。然后呢，以身作则，然后让大家看到说这是一个很好的典范，然后也愿意加总起来，整个团队会有更好的效益。他是说，如果是可以这样子的话，就会更好。OK， 然后下一个
I'm
I'm
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
Yes, go
Oh,
ahead.
I might just add that leaders are who creates culture of an organization is often set by leaders. And so if they want to create a culture that values humble leaders and humility in general, this is one aspect in which they can really demonstrate that humble leadership is by owning their own mistakes and failures. They are now setting this culture of a humble leadership, an organization that values humble leadership. So looking at their culture of what they want to set.
All right. Jessica 补充是说，其实一个组织的文化是由他的资深的领导者来形成的。所以呢，如果这个组织希望能够拥有一个比较开放或者是一个重视谦虚领导这个特质的文化的话呢，如果他们能够知道说他们要以身作则来做这个示范，然后可能那会就更好，让他们看到这一点。OK。
I have one more thing to add real quick.
Yes,
it's
please.
great that everyone has attended here, because I don't know how well known the power of humility in leaders can be. So spreading the word about its effectiveness that we've understood through research and we've seen in practice. It also starts with conversations that we're having here with you guys. So.
Yeah, and just add one little tidbit, like showing the ROI too is something that we know, like leaders are very receptive to, and that often gets that buy-in. So if there's resistance to, not wanting to admit mistakes kind of thing, showing the research that this increases performance and all these other positive outcomes, and, doing a criterion validation study too within your own organization to get that as well is another just great practice.
OK， 好，这两位补充的是说，非常感谢各位的参与，可以知道说他们在谦虚领导这方面做的这些研究，那大家也可以从这些数据上面来看到说，谦虚领导的确是会有一个它的投资报酬率是很高的。如果大家能够帮忙去推广这个概念的话，然后运用这些数据，这些是有数据上面验证过的一些结果，那组织的领导者通常是很重视这个 ROI 的，让他们又看到这个投资报酬率的话，那效果就会更好。Right? Let me move on to the next question. Okay. 那does this mean that we are suggested to develop all our leaders to become more humble leaders? Okay. The question is, okay.
Sorry, do you want to translate first?
Yeah, let me translate first.
Okay.
刚刚有一位观众提问说，那这是意思是说，我们需要把我们所有领导者都把他培养成、发展成一个比较谦虚的领导者呢 ？Yes. Yes, please. I'm done.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we would say that, we think everyone could probably use a little bit of humility, but it's super important to make sure you're doing a job analysis to start with. Is this an important aspect for this position, this leader? Is it a quality that's valued? And having that content and criterion validity is super important to show this is predictive of performance in the role. And leads to those vast positive outcomes we went through in the presentation. And then developing is something that, again, I think anyone could benefit from leveraging some of those behaviors at some point in their career, because it is a very other-oriented competency, and there's a lot of collaboration in a lot of organizations. So just having kind of that self-awareness is good. But yeah, Nadine, Jessica, anything to add?
Let me translate this first. Okay. Alright. 刚刚呢，他的回应是说，首先你一定要先看他的工作的分析，这个工作的内容，他的需求。那当然啦，你要培养一个谦虚的那个能力，的确是在你的工作职场上面都会很需要的。因为呢，我们在工作上面需要很多的合作，所以呢，有这样的自我察觉，一定是更好的。Anyone want to add to this question?
I think Zaina spoke really well to it.
Okay. All right. Let me move on to the next question. I think this is okay. 在越来越快速应变的环境挑战，组织希望领导人更快速应问题。Okay. 我把它翻译成英文。Because the environment is changing so fast, and the organizations, they really hope that leaders can adjust quickly to address the problems, the issues. And at the same time, employees, they crave, they desire decisive leaders. How can we encourage humility in leadership under this expectation? Do you understand me?
Yes, I think so. Oh,
okay.
Nadine, did you want to? Sorry.
Did you want to talk about the context dependence and, when it helps, in times of crisis and all that?
You're answering the question fantastic right now.
Okay, then I guess I'll go for it. So I think the biggest thing here is for a leader to be aware of the space that they're leading in. So as Jessica had mentioned before, maybe in terms of crisis or when everybody is looking like unsure of what to do, that's when a leader really needs to come up and sort of be confident, right? But remember too that you can be you can hold humility and you can still be confident and know what you're doing. It's a matter of having that sort of versatility in the space to be aware of what are the folks needing, what can I bring to the table, what am I deficient in that I should be leaning on others. And I think together that creates this environment of being able to get through the problem or get through that situation. So it may be sort of a lot of effort on the leader, but as Jessica also mentioned, leadership is hard, and being able to flex is a difficult skill to hone. But I think it's just being aware of what is the situation, what do the people need, and how do you fit in that space? How do you complement it? And that awareness of those strengths and limitations can really drive a clear path forward to get past the hurdle, past the problem, get through whatever the situation is. Does that answer the question? Did I address it fully?
I think so. I think so.
Awesome.
Okay, let me translate that. 在这样子的环境下面呢，我们觉得是说，在危机或者是在不确定的环境下面的时候，其实领导者的确是需要非常有自信，但是呢，同一个时候呢，这个领导者必须要有那个觉察力，知道说，这个氛围会需要什么，他需要去要了解到，他应该以这样的心态去了解到说，他可以补充什么，他可以提供什么，他可以为这个现在的状况提供什么样的助力去领导大家。不知道这样子有没有回答这个问题？Okay, one more question. If the feedback for me is too humble, how and what top 3 behaviors I can shift to not be too humble? Let me translate first. Okay, 如果大家对我的回应是说我太谦虚了，那我有什么样3者重要的行为我可以做，可以跨越那个太谦虚的这个特质？ Yes, please. 3 top behaviors to shift to be not too humble.
Can I ask a secondary question? Is too humble all synonymous with not being confident enough or almost being self-loathing or self-deprecating?
他要回应这位提问者是说，你的意思是太谦虚的意思是说不够有自信吗？还是太过于贬低自己呢？ If so, then what? I mean,
Yeah, well, I think, depending on what too humble truly is getting at, I would think that if the person is showing too much humility, they're showing that they don't really know, what's going on, or they're not really sure what the answer is. Don't forget your strengths, right? So sometimes we think of on one side, you're closer to these more narcissistic like tendencies. So you're too confident. So you have to remember your weaknesses. But remember, if you're self-deprecating or you feel unsure or uneasy, don't forget your strengths, right? So that might be a little bit of the flip side to be considering. So I would say that's at least one behavior that comes to mind right away. I guess the alternative too around like sharing credit and acknowledging others' strengths and contributions. Don't forget to acknowledge your own in that space. Sometimes it can be we, and it can be we did it, or it was us, it was ours. But don't forget to make sure that you give yourself credit, assuming you have an accurate awareness of the situation and how you played a part in it. And then also, being open to new ideas and feedback, for example, is also really good, but also knowing, hey, maybe I need to turn the noise down because I know the answer. And I don't need to hear from everybody for this particular problem or this particular situation. So just as much as there are a lot of behaviors that can make you more humble, probably as somebody who's a little bit more confident, there is sort of another side to probably think about that if you are one who continually defaults to other people or does not acknowledge your own strengths in the space.
Let me translate that. 如果是对自己太谦虚这个特质呢，是说，如果他提醒大家都是说，如果不要忘记是说你其实 如果你展现的是不够自信，这个时候就要提醒自己，我是有优点的，要让自己想到自己有一些优点。那第二件事情是说，如果你常常是把功劳会归功于大家的时候，不要忘记你自己在这方面你所扮演的角色跟你的贡献。你还是要肯定自己，该肯定自己，该给自己 credit 的时候还是要的。那另外一个就是说，当你非常对回馈非常的开放的时候，有时候你必须要把外面这些太多的声音太多声音稍微做一些控制。有些你必须要这个时候要很果断的说，其实我已经知道了答案，我可能不需要这么多的回馈，要在这方面做一些判断。OK， 请问还有其他的问题吗？OK， if I think that will be all for all the questions. Okay, so thank you very much for everything, all for very fruitful. Let me share my screen first. Okay. Sorry. Thank you very much for all the exciting content you have shared. Okay. And thank you for all this insightful and all the solid data behind all this research. And before we end,我想跟大家说，谢谢大家的参加，然后也谢谢所有的专家来跟我们的分享。那最后我要提醒大家，我们在3月12跟13呢，我们有一个基础认证的课程，欢迎大家来参加。那如果没有其他的问题的话，那我们今天就到此结束。OK， let's see. All right. 谢谢大家 Thank you everyone. And I will until next time. All right.
谢谢
Thank
大
you.
家，新年快乐！
新年快
谢谢
乐，
大家，拜拜。
拜拜。停止分享。All right. Thank you, Krista. I'm gonna. All right.
还有个问题，请问课程怎么